Discover Geography, Lesson 4-2, the Demographic Transition. One of the big worries that we often encounter when talking about population is the question of whether there are too many people on Earth, or whether there are soon going to be too many people. You can see the reason for this worry when we look at this graph of total world population going back into 10,000 BCE. We see that the population was so low that we can barely even see it on this graph until a little over 2,000 years ago. The world's population didn't reach even 1 billion until 1804. And yet, in the last couple hundred years, the population has skyrocketed. This graph maxes out at 6 billion in the year 2000, but in fact, we're now at over 7 billion people in the world. With such an incredibly dramatic increase in the world population, we can see why people would be worried about whether there might be too many people for the world to support. One of the first people to really think about this issue, and the one who is often cited in support of the idea that we're headed for overpopulation, for having too many people in the world, is an English parson by the name of Thomas Robert Malthus. Malthus argued that the world food supply can at best increase at an arithmetic growth rate. An arithmetic growth rate means a constant rate of growth over time. It creates a nice straight line sloping upward on your graph here. Now, of course, you need a certain minimum amount of food per person in order to support the population. And so that food supply line represents the maximum number of people that could be supported with that amount of food. On the other hand, Malthus argued that the population would grow geometrically. A geometric growth rate is a growth rate that increases over time, that grows faster and faster. Any arithmetic growth rate will ultimately be overtaken by any geometric growth rate. No matter how much lower the geometric growth rate starts out and no matter how much slower it rises, eventually any geometric growth rate will catch up with any arithmetic growth rate. In this case, that means eventually the population will catch up to the amount of people our food supply can support, at which point we'll be in a situation of potential overpopulation. If our population were to continue to grow after that point, we'd have too many people to feed, and starvation would bring the population back down in line with what the food supply can support. So Malthus believed that this was inevitable. His argument for the increase in the food supply was based on calculations from the expansion of the American frontier. So here was a situation in which we could bring huge amounts of new land under cultivation, increase our food supply, and he said that it still is only giving us kind of an arithmetic growth rate. And even that is a pretty high growth rate because we don't have any more continents to explore, and so we have limits to how much we can really expand our food supply. On the other hand, he expected the population would inevitably grow geometrically because population growth is a result of more people being born than are dying, and people are born because people have sex, and people like to have sex. And the only thing that would restrict them from having more and more children is the idea that they wouldn't be able to feed those children. So we can see how a geometric growth rate can easily occur in a population. If we start with one woman, let's say she has 2 daughters. If they each have 2 daughters, we then have 4 people in that third generation. 1, 2, 4, then 8 in the following generation. It's a clear geometric growth rate to the population. Yet if we look at what's going on in our world today, we see a number of inconsistencies with the Malthusian idea that overpopulation is inevitable. First, if we look at our food supply per capita, so this is food per person, not just total food availability, we see that over the last half century, that's been on an upward trend. If we were headed for overpopulation, that would be on a downward trend. There'd be less food available per person every year. And if we look at which countries are experiencing the highest population growth rates, we see it's the poor countries, the countries that are already struggling to feed their people, have the highest population growth rates, and yet the rich countries, the countries that could afford to feed more people, countries like the United States and Western Europe, have some of the lowest population growth rates in the world. This is inconsistent with the idea that only a lack of food could restrain the population growth rate. And in fact, if we look at our global population growth rate, we can see that global population growth peaked in the 1960s and 70s. So at that point, the population was growing the fastest that it's ever grown in human history. But since that time, it's declined. So on this graph, this is the growth rate. And so anytime this graph is above 0, the population is growing. And yet you can see it's growing at a slower rate as we go on, and it's projected to continue to slow down decades into the future. Here's what that looks like in terms of total population. We see a big increase in population through the middle of the 20th century. And that's what we saw in that first graph, that huge uptick in world population. And yet when we project our growth trends into the future, we see the total global population, which is now past 7 billion, leveling off somewhere between 9 and 10 billion people. So something is going on here that wasn't accounted for in Malthus's theory, and that it isn't accounted for by people who continue to predict a Malthusian type of crisis with extreme overpopulation inevitably hitting the world. And that factor that isn't accounted for in Malthus's theory is something called the demographic transition. The demographic transition is a model that explains what tends to happen to countries as they go through industrialization. So there are 4 or possibly 5 stages to the demographic transition that show changes in the death rates and birth rates for a population as it industrializes. And the upshot of the demographic transition is that countries will go from a fairly stable low population through a period of high population growth, but then their population will stabilize again. It will not continue to grow forever. The demographic transition begins in the pre-industrial stage. So this is stage 1 when a country is largely agricultural. During this stage, death rates are fairly high. There's a lot of things that can kill you in a pre-industrial agricultural society. There are a lot of diseases that frequently strike, especially for very young children. There are a lot of types of accidents that can happen that people won't survive. And so to compensate for that high death rate, people tend to have a lot of children. So we have a very high birth rate. You see in the picture there a pioneer family in Canada with a very large number of children. That kind of offsets the high death rate that would have been experienced in that situation. And so in stage 1, high death rate and high birth rate means a fairly stable, sometimes slightly increasing population. As the country begins to industrialize, we move into stage 2. In stage 2 of the demographic transition, the death rate begins to fall rapidly. The reason for the fall in the death rate is improved sanitation. That is the biggest cause of the fall in the death rate as countries begin to industrialize. With industrial production at our disposal, we can install better sewage systems, better water provision systems that can eliminate a lot of the major causes of death during the first stage. We can get rid of waterborne diseases that used to kill large numbers of people. And so our death rate drops dramatically. On the other hand, the birth rate remains high. People's cultural norms about how many children you should have and what makes for a good family haven't shifted as quickly. And so as long as our birth rate is well above the death rate in stage 2, we get growth in our population. So as countries begin to industrialize, they see a big population boom. As we move into stage 3 of the demographic transition, the death rate starts to level off. By this point in a country's development, we've solved all the easy causes of death. It's easy, comparatively, to install a sewer system to virtually eliminate cholera. It's much harder to cure things like cancer and heart disease. So our death rate starts to level off. It stops dropping as rapidly. On the other hand, the birth rate starts to fall in stage 3. And we can summarize the reasons for the fall of the birth rate under 2 headings: economics and feminism. Under the heading of economics, the economic incentives for having children shift in an industrial society. In a pre-industrial agricultural society, children were an economic asset to the family. Children from a very young age could start working on the farm and could start therefore contributing to the household's subsistence. And when the parents got old, they needed to rely on their children to support them. That was the main way you could get taken care of when you got too old to work, was to have children who would take you in. So there was a strong economic incentive to have lots of children to make sure at least some of them became successful adults. In an industrial society, however, children are not an economic asset to the family when they're young. Children can't work in jobs that are going to bring in a substantial income to the family in most cases. We have child labor laws preventing that. And so children are a cost to the family. It costs money to raise children in an industrial society. Furthermore, there are a lot of ways to provide for yourself in old age that don't require you to have your own personal children to rely on. There are social security systems that get created. So there's government aid for people in their old age. There are pensions and retirement accounts that you can create, that you can put your money wages into while you work, so that you then get a payment once you retire. So it's no longer necessary to have your own children to support you in your old age. So the economic incentives to have lots of children go away in an industrial society. On the other hand, we also have increases in women's rights, leading to lower birth rates. In many agricultural societies, women have very few rights. Women aren't able to control their own reproduction. They aren't able to decide to have fewer children if that's what they want. There aren't really other options in life besides being a mother. Women have limited ability to say no to sex and to use birth control to be able to prevent pregnancy when they do have sex. In an industrial society, and a society that has experienced a feminist movement, those things start to change. Women see other opportunities in life besides spending their entire life bearing children, and they decide to pursue those opportunities instead of just having children. They'll have fewer children, even no children, because of that. They're able to control their own reproduction. They're able to say no to sex. They're able to insist on using birth control so that they don't have children when they don't want to have them. And so overall, the birth rate is going to decline as a result of that as well. So during stage 3, we see leveling off of death rates, decline in birth rates. Birth rates are still above death rates, so we still see population growth, but it's growth that's now slowing down through stage 3. When we get to stage 4, we see that our death rates are now low and the birth rates have dropped to meet them. So we see again a situation in which our birth and death rates are about the same, and so our population will be stable. We have the same number of people being born as are dying. This is a somewhat different type of population than we'd see in stage 1, however. In stage 1, we're having a lot of people born and a lot of people dying, so we get a population that's skewed very young. We have a lot of children coming out, but not very many of them making it to older ages. In stage 4, we have a population that skews older. So we have not that many children being born, but they get to live for quite a long time. On the diagram, you see a stage 5 marked with dotted lines. This is because we're seeing in some countries today, countries like Italy, Greece, Japan, birth rates have continued to fall below our death rates. So the decrease in the birth rates that happened in stage 3, those factors are still in place and are still driving down birth rates. So we actually see societies where our death rates are higher than birth rates, and we're now seeing population declines in those countries if we factor immigration out of the picture. It's unclear whether this is a stage that every country is going to get to if they go through the full demographic transition, or if this is a stage that's only happening to certain countries. So that's why it's in dotted lines on the diagram. But it is something that's happening in some countries where the birth rates have continued to fall. The population has continued to age because we have very few people being born, but they get to live a very long life. And we can see evidence of the demographic transition in the population pyramids of different countries. There aren't any countries left that are really in stage 1 of the demographic transition, although there are certain remote rural areas in certain parts of the world that if we looked at just that area, we'd have something like a stage 1. The upper population pyramid you see there, though, is the country of Yemen, which is pretty well in a stage 2 of the demographic transition. And so what you see there is a population that skews younger. You see a pyramid that gets very wide at the base. So we have a lot of children being born, but not very many of them making it into the older ages. As a country transitions into stage 3, you would start to see those bars toward the bottom of our population pyramid evening out. You would start to see each age bracket being closer to the size of the one above it as our birth rates slow down. When we get to stage 4, you would see a population pyramid with straight up and down sides. So this would be a population pyramid where each generation is just as big as the one before it. So that would be a stable population, excluding immigration and emigration for the moment. If you get into that potential stage 5, you get something like the bottom diagram that you see there for the country of Italy, where the population pyramid gets narrower at the base. In this case, we're having fewer and fewer children in every age bracket. And so the bulk of our population is now in the older ages.